Our next session, Translating Feminist Text Beyond the Neutral Linguistic Act. Our panelists are Manisha Chaudhary, Shaini Antony, Shomita Dasgupta, Shatabdi Das, and the facilitator is Paramita Chakraborty. A few words about the panelists and our moderator. Manisha Chaudhary has many years of experience as a publishing professional and in the social development sector. She began her professional career in India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, in 1986, and has been a consultant to a range of organizations in the development sector and the UN. An editor and translator fluent in English and Hindi, her work has been published by Kali for Women, Oxford University Press, Zuban Books, and many others. Her translation, A Street in Srinagar, of the Hindi novel Ailan Gali Zinda Hai by Chandra Kanta, was shortlisted for the DSC Prize for Literature in 2012. Her most recent translation, The Chipko Movement, A People's History of Shekhar Pathak's Hari Bhari Ummeed, has been awarded the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Book Prize in 2022. Manisha was editorial head at Pratham Books, a not-for-profit multilingual children's publisher, since its inception until 2017. She's a severally published author of children's books and has translated numerous others. As one of the founder trustees of Bookaroo Children's Literature Festival, she spearheaded the initiative of Bookaroo in the city. The Children's outreach of the Jaipur Literature Festival was started under her guidance. She has been advisor to the Kahani Festival and Jumpstart, a children's content congress run by the German Book Office. She is an invited member to the publishing committee of FICCI. She has been in the forefront of many new initiatives to democratize the joy of reading and books and improve equity in education. She works as an independent consultant for publishing and translation initiatives. Currently, she leads Jaipur Bookmark, the publishing segment of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and has recently concluded the Zuban Prabha Khaitan translation program. Shaini Antony is the author of Eden Abandoned, The Story of Lilith, a novella that won the Wise Owl Prize for Fiction 2025, was longlisted for all her author awards and has been translated into Bangla by the Antonym Collections. Her other novellas include The Girl Who Couldn't Love and Can't, longlisted for the Crossword Award. She has compiled the anthologies Hell Hath No Fury, Boo, Why We Don't Talk, and Unsuitable Woman, and co-edited The Art of Holding On, Letting Go, where many authors come together to examine grief via objects left behind. Her first book was a collection of short stories, Barefoot and Pregnant, on dysfunctional motherhood. One of her stories, A Dog's Death, won the Commonwealth Short Story Asia Prize in 2002. Shatabdi Das is a Kolkata-based storyteller who believes that true learning often begins with unlearning. A teacher by profession and a gentle disruptor by nature, she spends 6 days a week unsettling what we take for granted, and the 7th reimagining anew. In Once Upon the Queens, she retells familiar fairy tales through a new voice, weaving rebellion, tenderness, and magic into one seamless spell. Shomita Dasgupta is a co-founder of Manavi, the first organization to focus on violence against South Asian women in the US. She has taught psychology, gender studies, and law at the Rutgers University and NYU, authored 5 books, written a bunch of academic papers and monographs, and is still conducting training for DV and SV practitioners in the US and India. In her retirement, she is enjoying writing mystery stories in Bengali. Our moderator for this session, Dr. Paramita Chakraborty, professor in the Department of English at Jadavpur University and former director of the School of Women's Studies. A distinguished scholar, she completed her doctoral research on early modern discourses of madness at the University of Oxford. Her teaching spans Renaissance drama, women's writing, queer studies, and film studies, inspiring generations of students. Dr. Chakraborty has held visiting fellowships at Oxford, Liverpool, Hyderabad, and Delhi, and her research on Shakespeare and early modern studies has been published in leading international journals and edited volumes. Her notable book, Women Contesting Culture, co-edited with Professor Kavita Punjabi, reflects her deep engagement with questions of gender and culture. May I invite our panelists and our facilitator on stage.
It gives me great pleasure and joy, as it always does, to be among women and feminist women. It's the sort of greatest joy in life. Today we will be talking about roughly around the question of what constitutes a feminist translation, what is a good feminist translation. One of the things, very interesting things that Shobhita Di and I were having a conversation about is that, because that's the kind of pairing that we noticed for antonym, that women translate women's texts and women design covers of women's texts. And this is Shobhita Di pointed this out, and maybe we can begin with that idea. What does it mean? What are the sort of intersections of gender ideology with the imperatives of translation? Because the title of, I think of the panel is that translation is not a neutral act. We know this. It's a deeply political act. Because every translation is also an interpretation of a text. It's a reading of a text. And what does it mean, when you're translating? How does that reading or how does that interpretation come across? So I think, as feminist translators, how do we indeed read the text? So it's not just a question of rendering it in another language, but actually what constitutes our feminist understanding of the text is also embedded in the translation itself. So I would request all panelists to, we can just begin with that idea of what do you see as a feminist translation. I wouldn't ask you necessarily what are the strategies of feminist translation. This is something that gets discussed often, but I don't think, it's very context dependent. So anyway, so if you could just respond to that idea of what for you is a feminist translation, what are its qualities, and how does one go about it, roughly. We are running sort of behind time, behind schedule in an appalling way. So I think, each of you, I would request you to be sort of brief and pointed, and maybe sort of roughly 3 minutes, 4 minutes each. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to race through my thoughts on this. I've been thinking about this since the last panel, which was on AI, and which kept talking about subjectivity and things like that. And I really, for me, being a feminist and being a feminist who's involved with the business of words, I think it is to privilege subjectivity of women. For me, really, a feminist translation is one that understands that subjectivity it is that make things truly human. And I want to be unapologetic about it. I don't want to keep pretending to have an objectivity vis-a-vis the text, which does not make me an unethical person, I hope. Which is, I hope that my dharma as a translator does not get compromised because of that. But I do not want to apologize for the fact that my reading will be entirely subjective, therefore human, and therefore perhaps important. Because when we are looking at the whole business of creativity and originality, it is only when we acknowledge how subjective it is to each of us and that expression of subjectivity as being valuable and giving a perspective which is uniquely my own, which is giving a reading which is deep in a way that only I can bring that depth to it, and not because I went to school or college or whatever else. I mean, those trained me in the hygiene functions of education, but hopefully what I draw from that education and what I therefore produce as cultural work should be informed by who I am as a person. And I believe that as a woman, I do read things somewhat differently. I do use language differently. I was talking over lunch today, pardon my rambling on about this, but it's important. But my dadi used to speak.
Rambling is also feminist. Yeah.
No, I wouldn't use that as an excuse. The way my grandmother used to speak the Western UP dialect that she spoke in and the kind of idiom that she used, that was her power. And that is what I remember about her. Her storytelling was informed by her language and her experience of language in her context. And that is what made her unique. So if I'm going to continue to be in the business of words, I should somewhere hang on to that uniqueness and not say that, oh my God, I'm a woman, am I being too female about this? Am I being too feminine about this? I mean, I think I should be.
Thank you very much. So being brazen about our feminism and our subjectivities, how would you like to, for instance, respond to that idea or anything else?
So this is my first translation in any case. And for me, translating a feminist text is not only transferring the meaning, but also transferring the resistance, the kind of subversion, the kind of agency that was in the original text across the linguistic mediums. So this is about it, and the translator must identify with the anger that is embedded in the text. I don't know, they're referring to that conversation about the AI as Monisha Di also did. I don't know how to feed AI with that anger so that it can produce a translation of a feminist text. So throughout this journey of translating Shaynee's text, I had to keep this in mind, that the anger should not be subdued, and the irony, the sarcasm that rises out of that anger, as well as, in her case, sexuality and body politics. So you have to identify with all this in order to translate a feminist text, I think.
Thank you very much. That point about anger is very pertinent, particularly because Shobita Di has just translated Kavita Singho's 4 Angry Women. So if you could tell us something about translating anger, translating feminist outrage and anger.
Thank you. The first thing I have to say, I totally agree with Parumita, that translation is never neutral, and it certainly is a political act. It is not something that we do, taking the codes of one language and moving it to another, or literally transporting it to another culture, but it is a political act. And the feminist politics that we are, when we are translating, that we have, is to look at it differently, to decenter the male perspective, and to actually put in a point of view, ethos, sensibilities of women, and highlighting it. Sometimes the text may not have it, but how we choose the words, how we structure a sentence, where we end a sentence, where we continue with a sentence, all of that is can be a feminist act, and because we are looking at it from a feminist perspective, looking to give voices, or highlighting the voices of women in their conditions of living, their experiences. All of those things have to be kind of spotlighted. And part of it, that is how we do, I think we do feminist readings and feminist translations. Just to give you an example, the 4 Angry Women is about 4 teenagers. young teenagers who are kind of exploring. I mean, I could have thought of this as exploring their sexualities and who they are, their experiences on the backdrop of Kolkata. I read it as literally, and the name itself says it, because obviously Kavita Singh thought of it like that, is to see them as really angry about the oblivion of their teenage lives, of their teenage experiences, of believing that their struggles are not being acknowledged. Their oppression is not being acknowledged. I read it like that throughout, and that is what I felt I had to say. Not to neutralize it, not to dismiss it, but to highlight those. I mean, just to give you one example, I chose the word spinster, which is certainly not a feminist word, in here to describe the oldest sister of two of the protagonists in there. And why did I do that? It was a very deliberate act that I chose to use the word spinster. Mainly to highlight, and I hope I've been, I'm not that great a translator, but I hope I've been able to bring it to the readers, that to basically highlight the situation of the society where a woman who is unmarried after a certain age is basically dismissed, is basically insulted because she is not anchored with a man, or a man doesn't anchor her, whatever that might be. And it's a very deliberate choice to say spinster. And kind of reclaiming that word for what it is. It's an insult of the patriarchal society, patriarchal ethos. And so those kinds of little pieces, and I'm getting a little better at it. I wasn't that great. I'm still not very good. I'm not like Paramita. I'm not, English is not my subject. But at least I'm trying, and let's see what happens.
I think they were called spinsters because their virginity was monetized as spinning. They would just come out with cloth and fabric and sewing and embroidery, which was all considered so feminine. And
But the interpretation now has...
yeah, of course, as a word. But I think in Kerala, I've seen that women who are waiting to get married, they would just keep on doing a double degree and then MA and then, PhD. And it's basically like just waiting for the groom to arrive. It's just like that. It's the same spinster's journey when others are expecting you to settle down, quote unquote, settle down. I think for the longest time, male anger has been very seductive. Their aggression is very attractive. It's almost foreplay, Whereas female anger has always been considered an oxymoron. Because female and anger are not two words that kind of go together. You'll get proposals from guys, whether broker or whoever will tell you that, the guy, he's dynamic, he's dashing, his salary is this, that, and the other. He's always so sharp and angry. No proposal goes out for a woman saying she loses her temper 24/7. That does not translate like that. And women from childhood are trained, even the way they laugh, silently into their hand. We are trained how to sit not with our legs apart. We have to keep our legs together. Even as children, we are taught that. And I think this whole predator-prey thing that happened in the planet, to start with, the mightier animal will suppress the muter animal, the smaller animal. That went on to such an extent that we had to fight back sati, we had to fight back dowry deaths, honor killings, female infanticide, even female feticide. It's so embarrassing that for a foreigner who comes in here, goes to the hospital, sees scans are illegal. Why are scans illegal? They want to know, because if it's a baby girl, then things might happen to that baby girl. She may not happen. And there were villages I read about where there were no brides for the men. And they had to go and get brides from another village. Or many brothers married the same woman. So what is going to happen to this gender balance if this anger is not balanced out? So men can calm down a little, but women really need to get angry, you know. So I feel a woman, if she's angry, she can be called a fish wife. She can be called, there are no fish husbands. There are only fish wives. And we are called shrews and we are called hysterical. And it's that time of the month and it's that time of your life. It's that time of the day. It's that time of the hour. It's everything. But that your anger is legal. It's legitimate. That you're entitled to your anger. They try to take that away from you. A woman who's angry and who's articulate in her anger is a work of art.
Thank you for those initial responses. I'm sort of shifting gears a little bit from the actual sort of work of translation that many of you have engaged in and thinking a little bit about also the politics of language itself. I mean, not just the gender dynamics within language, the patriarchy of languages, but also hierarchies and power dynamics between languages. So, because what does it mean to translate into English? What does it mean to translate from English? Where English in the Indian context particularly is associated with so much privilege and colonization and the language of power and the language of men and the language of access. So how do you negotiate the politics between languages is a question I would like you to sort of respond to, not just as translators, but also as feminists, because, and this is a question that I think even if you're not a translator, even if you're a feminist, you are a translator. Because we are constantly told that feminism is a Western concept, that it is a colonial concept, that it is something, you know, like homosexuality we have got from the West. Nobody would have become these angry young women if you know, the Mem Sahibs had not taught us. And a lot of feminist theory and a lot of feminist work that we do happens to be couched in English, in concepts which are English. For instance, you know, even the terms that we've dealt with, you know, we've struggled. And you know, our constituencies often constitute women who have no access to English. So in a way, being feminist is being a translator. In a way. So I still remember in the 90s, you know, we were really struggling with language. Feminist work was a struggle with language and a struggle with local language. You know, what is Narivad, Pitri Sattva, Pitri Tantro? I mean, we were not happy with these words. I mean, they were very Sanskritized words which were not organically, you know, coming from any of our local languages. And to have to go and, you know, conduct workshops which were supposed to, you know, be these sort of instant moments of communication and then come up with words like Pitri Sattva was, I think, you know, extremely alienating and difficult. So I think, in a way, in our feminist work, we always negotiate languages and concepts. So, you know, for instance, even things like domestic work, domestic violence, you know, garhosto hingsha. I mean, how easily does that slip off your tongue? I mean, doesn't. So I would just sort of ask you to reflect a little bit on whether being a feminist is being a translator continuously, and what does that mean for us?
So if translation at the most basic level is interpretation of meaning in a variety of words, I'm not worried about Pitra Satta not tripping off my tongue easily. I'm happy that it exists. I'm happy that the word exists and there is the possibility of my reinterpreting it in my context. I can call it Purush Kendrit Samaj. I can call it a whole lot of other things. I can use the muhavras again from my foremothers, who used it in different contexts to say things much more simply. But the fact that the language exists for me to unpack in ways that was not available to my grandmother, I think that in itself is a great power that I have. I see it as an opportunity to shape language. I see it as an opportunity to destigmatize words, especially to do with the female body. Every time that we are translating things to do with sexual relations or the human body, very often the words which are understood are considered vulgar, or they have vulgar connotations in how we talk. So can I sort of take my courage in my hands and say that I'm going to do it because it actually describes something that all of us have some experience of, and therefore take away the stigma, take away the shame which is associated with uttering those words in public. So I think the opportunity that translation presents to feminists are manifold. When you say that we are literally interpreting and translating constantly, we are doing that in the context of caste. We are doing that in the context of class. We are trying to sort of create a more sensitive vehicle for the human experience, where the relationship between the two genders can perhaps be made more equitable, simply because I use language with the kind of flourish that is not bound by the sort of strictures that it has always existed within. Earlier, a lot of it used to happen in oral speech, right? Women always used elliptical modes of communication. I'm going to, again, my grandmother's on my mind today. She used to say, "Jinne khada na dikhta, unne baitha kya dikhega." If a person who cannot see a person who's standing up can barely see a person who's going to be sitting down. So now that was it's just an elliptical way of saying something, rather than saying that you fool, you don't see what you can see kind of thing. She would say it like this. So, and this kind of idiomatic speech was very much a woman's way of speaking. That was in the zanana or the haram or whatever. Very often you used elliptical modes of speech which were very layered and rich. It was also stigmatized as tiriya charitra, which is like not being direct, and women are kind of, there's always subterfuge, they're sort of saying things in 20,000 ways and so on and so forth, but yeah, why not, And it really kind of, I think it enriches language, and I think it gives us the opportunity to use the same language that we know, and take away some of the stigmas that have been associated with it, and use it with a kind of freshness, and again, with the sense of subjective control. I own this language. I own it to say the things that it has not said before. And if I say it with a sort of certain authenticity and conviction, I'm pretty sure that we are pushing the envelope one book at a time.
Thank you. Shadati, if you want to respond to
that. When you say that feminists are translators by nature, that gives rise to another question that I would like to put forward to Shiny to respond. I think actually there has been a lot of mythological retelling in feminist texts, and that even Abandoned is all about that. It's also a mythological retelling. So I felt that is also a kind of translation. You are translating a myth and recreating it, interpreting it in your own way. And then I'm Yeah. I revisited and retold the fairy tales, an anthology of fairy tales, which is very popular in Bengali. It was compiled by Dakshinaranjan Mitra Mojumdar in the 19th century, and I tried to retell them from a feminist and post-colonial perspective. It was last year, and that was published by Antonym also, and it was then translated in English as well. And the interesting thing is that I was interacting with someone in the lounge, and he told me that it is being translated again in Assamese. So there lies the importance of translating feminist texts. I don't know whether the Assamese translator is translating it from Bengali or from English, whatever may be the case. There is a kind of dialogue set between the feminists. So there is a kind of regional solidarity that is established through translation. And English, the language English here plays a crucial role. So this is what happens when you translate from regional language to English. But when you translate from English to Bengali or other regional languages, it can be used as a kind of tool for grassroots mobilization, right? For example, Shiny's text, it's a kind of reinterpretation of some version of Bible. So we work in some regions of South Chobbish Pargona where there is a kind of Christian affiliation in Canning and places like that. So Indian English literature is majorly read by the middle class. But when you translate it into Bengali, even the first generation learner can grasp it. So in activism too, this kind of translation, the reverse translation from Indian English to Bengali or any other regional language, this has its role to play.
Thank you so much, because I was also thinking about, within sort of feminist cultural theory, this is something well recognized that feminist knowledge is produced through translation. So much of feminist knowledge is really about, translating text and making it available to bigger and bigger audiences of women and building solidarities through translated texts. And increasingly one feels that, and also, Shomita is sitting right beside me. So increasingly we are being told that the future of feminism is transnational. So we really have to, even as we are being sort of caught in the trap of hypernationalism of our states, we have to forge solidarities across nation states. And for that, I think, translation is crucial and is going to be the most political act, perhaps, that will help, these solidarities to happen. So Shomita has worked transnationally and especially worked with a diasporic sort of community of Indians, Bangladeshis, and others, South Asians, yeah. And in a way, which sort of made us very aware of the need for such work. So if you would like to respond to that, or anything else indeed, about the politics of language and translation.
Thank you. Yeah, it is important. I think feminism by itself is intersectional and it is global. Particularly for activists who work in the area of violence against women, anti-violence against women work, it is extraordinarily important to recognize that the politics has to be global, although you'll be acting locally, because the understanding has to be global. And that is something I think important, and more Western women are recognizing it, particularly for annoying women like us who are there and who are saying continuously, hey, what do you mean by that? You have to change that. So I think that is very important. But however, we also learn from the Western world the idea of voice, women having a voice. That is certainly came from the Western world, that kind of an idea. Because traditionally, women were not supposed to, everywhere, not just here, but traditionally women were not supposed to have a voice, right? In Bangla, there's a proverb saying, "Purbe me urbe chai, tobe meer gun gai." Meaning women must not have voices, and only then they are good women or they are acceptable women. And yet we are saying now, as disobedient women, have a voice, scream, yell. If there is a problem or an issue somewhere, or an injustice, say it loudly, scream at the top of your voice to highlight that injustice. And that by itself is something that we have in common. And also, I think one thing that we are understanding now more and more is that one issue that ties women globally all over is violence against them. Nothing else. It cuts across class, it cuts across nationalities, old, young, any section that you look at. Violence is the only thing that cuts across everything and ties women together globally. And the form of violence may be different, but it's still, it's there. It has the same kind of or similar results. And I think that is something that we have to think about when we talk about intersectionality or globalization of ideas. And I find it very interesting, by the way, when you said that homosexuality is imported from. Yeah, what happened? I mean, if you look at all our old sculpture and this and that, it's already there. Well, okay, so it is.
I just want to reply to what Shatabdi asked me, why did I go in for Lilith, who's actually a very minor Christian figure, but more major Jewish figure. But I just thought, I'm a Christian, and my religion roots lie outside India. I am what is called a minority community here, and I'm the other minority community which nobody cares about. We can say anything, we can do anything, nobody really notices us. So we are under the radar, we are flying under the radar. So I thought, how do I go to the roots or study the roots of the Christianity which is not Western, but which is very much Indian, and in my case, very much Malayali from Kerala. I'm a Syrian Catholic from Kerala, and even the Syrian Catholic Christianity, which we trace back to St. Thomas, etc., every Christian in Kerala is related to St. Thomas in some form, But how are we different from the other Indian Christians? How are we different from definitely the foreign Christians? And what are my texts? What are my religious texts? Where do I source them? How do I study them? Because it's imported. It's not homegrown. So I think for me it was very important, just like mythology, Indian mythology goes back to Putna and, Kaikai and everybody else, people whom we want to understand as a character, we put them in first person, we make them characters in books. Let's put some of these lesser known characters who have come to me by baptism, by birth, because I'm born into a Christian family. Let me go back to those stories and interpret them for myself and not take the Western word for it. I think that's why I kind of came to Lilith's story, who was, by the way, Adam's first wife. Before Eve, God created Adam and Lilith equal from the same source material, from earth and from stars and from volcanoes and lava and etc. Eve was born out of his own body, and because he did not like what Lilith did to him, Lilith wanted to be his equal, and he threw her out of Eden. But what Lilith found when she walked out of Eden and walked very far away and looked back at Eden, Eden was just a small dot, and the rest of earth was hers. So that is Lilith's story. And also, Lilith is the patron demoness of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, before they knew what it was all about, because like all bad women, she was promiscuous and she loved snacking on little babies, and people made up songs to ward her away from taking their baby, and that was called a lullaby. So lullaby is actually Lilith, goodbye. As for translation, because I'm not a translator, all of them are. I'm not a translator. Yeah, but it's not like, it's English to English. But what I feel is it's high time we women put all our brain cells together into mistranslating male thoughts and making them think that feminism was their idea.
Thank you very much for this vibrant panel. The sort of floor is now open to questions. We have about 5 minutes, Kathakuli informs us, for questions and responses, yeah. So any questions? Or responses, anything at all? Wonderful session. If there are no questions, I think we'll just close with one final sort of round where we just take a minute to talk about, because this is something which strikes me about a lot of you, not about you because you write mostly in English, but the others are all bilingual, definitely, if not multilingual. So, Shomita, this is a question primarily for you, but also Monisha and Shatabdi, if you want to respond, also you, is that, we often think, because you're writing fiction in Bangla now, which I find absolutely fascinating, and you're writing detective fiction in Bangla now. So, and you've written most of your non-fiction in English. So how do we inhabit languages when we have the luxury of inhabiting several languages? What in us, or what is it that makes a language suitable for certain kinds of thoughts and another language suitable for something else? So we can begin with you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that's a hard question, because I've just done it very naturally. When I wrote about a woman, of course, detective, and all the stories that I write, detective stories, are women-centered, naturally. It just comes naturally to me because of who I am. Even though basically I grew up in the West, I identify South Asian mainly. And so that's an easy switch for me. And of course, the academic part is something that I had to do to survive in the academe. So it's an interesting swish back and forth. But before I give it to somebody else, and you probably have a better answer than anything, I want to plug one book. If you get a chance, Antonym published a translation of mine called The Caged. And it is something, it's one of the favorite stories, because it talks about the anger that we have been talking about, the anger and the unabashed expression of that anger is in that book. And I just absolutely loved that. So if you get a chance, please do read it, and you'll see why I'm so fond of doing feminist translations.
Shani, if you want to respond to, for instance, when you wrote fiction, why did English sort of seem preferred language rather than, say, Malayali?
I was brought up in the north of India, and Hindi is kind of my first tongue. So English was more like I had to polish. Even now, I love editing. I hate writing, because writing takes so much out of you physically, spiritually, mentally, intellectually, in every way that, and it's not like you plonk your backside on a chair and then you start typing. Writing is what happens when you're doing every other thing and really making bad sambar, etc. That's when it's kind of falling into place in your head, inside your head. So, I don't know.
Responses? Which languages do you inhabit? For what genres?
I would like to share one experience of mine while translating the book. I am comfortable writing in Bengali because apart from being an author, I also have this activist zeal in myself, and I want to reach people, more grassroots people. So writing in regional language is important for me. I want to, as I said, I have a very brief commentary on my experience of translating this text. While translating it in Bengali, and as you have heard, that it's a retelling of a certain version of a biblical myth. So the word blasphemy has a very central place in this text, and I did not, thankfully, it's a very positive thing that I did not find a synonym in Bengali for blasphemy. Yeah, a fall that is beyond recovery. I didn't find anything. If you can find it, please inform me. A single word, not a long phrase, that imbibes all the connotations and denotations of blasphemy. So I felt kind of blessed to be a part of a culture that did not generate a word like blasphemy. But the question remains that, have we lost it now? The culture that we now have around us is very different from perhaps the receptivity, the fluidity that has once been there. That's all.
They will soon come up with a word for blasphemy.
So for me, I think the distinction is fairly clear. I studied in English medium schools, so the language of intellect is English, and I come from a Hindi-speaking household with a lot of music, dance, and other things. That was all Hindi. So the language of emotion is quite clearly Hindi, and the language of intellect is English, but that is what led me to work in multilingual children's publishing, because I absolutely understand that it is the initial years when you're comfortable in your mother tongue, if you get good literature in your mother tongue, that is what forms the linguistic foundation for your ever becoming a reader and a thinker. And it is only when the false dichotomy between the intellect and the heart is broken down very summarily by translators or people who are multilingual, or who at least aspire to be multilingual, using the plasticity of our brains, and therefore bridge cultural divides in a much more organic fashion, simply because the distinction of, oh, English is intellectual and Hindi is emotional, it just breaks down. That logic, the flawed logic of that in itself breaks down. And I think having children's literature in your mother tongue is absolutely critical to build that faculty in you where the intellect and the heart are not separated. I think as a good ex-colonial, it was separated for the longest time, but I was also bitten by the bug of activism. So when you have to sort of work with people, you jolly well, be able to speak in either language, think in either language, and also ideate in either language, and not sort of see them as discrete activities which cannot overlap. Because as human beings, again, as subjective human being, I want as many overlaps as possible, as much integration as possible,
Thank you so much, panel, for being absolutely fantastic. Thank you, audience.
Thank you for that wonderful panel. Very, very vibrant and interesting. May I request our volunteers to hand the hampers to our guests.